History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography.
Yes, Dr. Clark.
History tells of people where they have been and what they have been,
Yes.
where they are and what they are.
Yes.
Most important, history tells a people where they still must go and what they still must be.
Yes, sir.
The relationship of history to the people is the same as the relationship of a mother to her child.
Yes, sir.
Whatsoever ye do all to the glory of God. That's a great principle.
And it doesn't have to be that way. You do not have to slaughter millions of people to get.
Welcome to the GILCHRIST Experience. Today's guest, Professor Dr. Leonard Jeffries. And we just saw Dr. Clark, who was a mentor to all of us that study history. History is to its people as a mother is to its child. So we've been siblings of Dr. Clark, and it's amazing to hear that. Every time I hear, I get inspired. And because so little we know. And you being the historian that you are, it's fascinating to see how you respond to something like that. Welcome to the show, Leonard Jeffries.
Well,
Professor, Doctor.
Certainly, Brother Winston. It's a pleasure to see any images of Dr. Clark. I was blessed to, when Wesley Snipes and our brother pulled together the video on Dr. Clark, the Great and Mighty Walk.
Right, that's what this is from.
I was blessed to, some people were blessed to walk with Dr. Clark, some strong moments, some had some years, some had some decades, but I personally had almost 50 years.
50 years.
And that's unusual. Wow. And it was meaningful relationship from the 50s on through till he left us. And so when I talk about a person who might have influenced me, first and foremost, intellectually and in terms of appreciating our history and struggle, it's Dr. John Henry Clark. Right. And when you realize he comes from a deep foundation of our people in the South, Alabama, Georgia,
right.
And at the time when it was almost against the law to teach us to read and write, and to even go into libraries, he had to falsify a white man's name in order to go into libraries. And the fact that he had difficulty accessing libraries, so he developed this desire to create a library process. And in the end, he was able to have his widow, Sister Sybil, send to Georgia. Well, when it was sent, he was alive, but his widow now, Sister Sybil, arranged to have 20,000 books on African people's history sent to the complex in Atlanta, the Woodruff Library, that nurtures Spelman, Morehouse, Clark Atlanta, and the theoretical. All those institutions there are nurtured by this library center, which has this enormous collection of Dr. Clark. So when you realize he had to struggle to even get an education or to get access to a library, and then he developed this desire, this fire in his belly to put together a collection that would teach the true history of our people. So just that alone, you had to have a smile on your face in knowing that he was able to achieve that. And but he wasn't alone. There were many bibliophiles, people who collected the works of our people. And one of the most significant was Arthur Schomburg.
Of course,
of African Puerto Rican background. And it was his collection, personal collection, that became the basis for this enormous collection we refer to that's in the Schomburg Center. And then, of course, Dr. Clark's partner, I call both of those, the two gentlemen, Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben, twin towers of light, shining to the world from Harlem.
Right.
And of course, we had our twin towers down in the Wall Street area, which were lost with the plane. But this twin tower light is eternal.
Right.
And Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark's knowledge will be shining as a special beacon for us. And Dr. Clark said we need to look at the African world and have an African perspective. Even looking at the European world, we need an African perspective. And we need to study the European world in order to study the missing pages of your history.
Exactly.
And, but Dr. Ben said, all of that is wonderful, and we need all of that. But if you do not laser beam into the Nile Valley, all 4,000 miles of it, and reclaim it, all the other knowledge that you have will not make the sense that it needs to make. So you had these two partners. One said you had to have an African mind and consciousness in order to appreciate history. One said, don't forget that particular history that is yours in the Nile Valley that has been stolen by others and grafted onto themselves, giving them a sense of pride and understanding, nurturing them, and at the same time, this stolen legacy has been denied you. And so that leaves you with an important missing component of your development. And as a result of this missing component of your development, we suffer greatly as Dr. Wade Nobles, one of our brothers, and his wife, Dr. Vera, a couple, a power couple. And Wade is is a psychologist. Dr. Asa Heed was the educational psychologist. And of course, his great wife, Pat. So you have these couples, families who have created institutions and organizations that have followed Dr. Clark in his path, because he created not only the collection of books, but he created institutions and organizations, and he fed movements. And so we followed that pattern. But Dr. Wade Nobles, in the area of psychology and the Africanization of psychology, said African people suffer greatly from a shattered consciousness and a fractured identity. And it is that shattered consciousness and fractured identity that Dr. Clark is referring to when he talks about history is like the mother to the child. It's a nurturer. But if we do not have a consciousness to appreciate it, it cannot empower us the way it should. And if our identity is so fractured we can't appreciate what it really means, then we can't use that identity for power.
How difficult is it
knowledge is power.
How difficult is to relate all this stuff to the youth today, though? How difficult
It's difficult
is that?
at this moment because our people have been seduced by technology, and we're seeking entertainment and diversion. When I was coming up, it was the beginning of the era of consciousness in the 40s and in the 50s.
But in the 50s, I mean, we were just talking about it, Sambo and
Yes,
Tarzan and Elizabeth Taylor.
Yes, but the beginning for me was in those. I was born in 1937.
Okay.
So in the 40s, my mother laid down, she was the nurturer.
Okay.
And in our home, there was a history of African people. The first book I had was Up From Slavery, Booker T. Washington. Before I could even read.
Where were you born?
I was born in Newark, New Jersey.
No, you were born in Newark.
She comes up from Virginia with a consciousness and an identity.
Yeah.
And her identity was that her father was a farmer. So he had a Booker T. Washington consciousness.
Right.
Put your buckets down where you are and build and control your world.
Right.
Coincidentally and interestingly enough, W.E.B. Du Bois in 1896 or 7 did a study of Farmville, Virginia, which was my mother's center. And the study was to study the migration of black people out of the South into Philadelphia. And that became the basis for his later great sociological work, The Philadelphia Negro. But he was studying the families in Farmville, Virginia. One of the families was my mother's family. So her great aunt, Pocahontas, became one of Du Bois's secretary.
Pocahontas?
So, because we were, part of my mother's side is Powhatan Indian. And so they carried that tradition with them. So she made us proud of the African. She made us proud of the Native American. She did not, and she made us consciousness of do not be seduced by the European American.
Okay.
So the pablum that I had was Booker T. Put your buckets down where you are. W.E.B. Du Bois, that you really need to create a leadership group that can lead you correctly, and Marcus Garvey, that we are global people. So my pablum and my brother's pablum was Booker T, W.E.B., and Marcus Garvey.
Okay.
So that's what the home was for me. So I was able to resist Little Red Riding Hood, Jack and the Beanstalk, Cinderella and the Seven Drawers, and all that mess. And I was rooting for Sambo. When little black Sambo was running from that tiger and around that tree, I was rooting for him. I can still see the imagery today. So in the home, the learning has to start in the home. So you have to have parents that are conscious, grandparents that are conscious, uncles that are conscious. We've lost a lot of that because now we let our education go through the technology, these gadgets of wonderment that have seduced our people. But the real nitty-gritty of history is the people's movement in history. Dr. Clark represents that, up from sharecropping. The son of a sharecropper becomes one of the greatest of our intellectual giants because it was in the home. He says, and he said many times, he said to us often, that I had 3 angels in my life. 3 deities. 1, my grandmother. 2, my mother. And 3, my 5th grade teacher, Eveline Taylor. So that's what we've lost now. It emerged in the 40s and 50s. My mother, at 12 years old, my mother sent me down to 15 Elm Street in Newark, New Jersey. That was the woman that headed the NAACP Youth Council, Miss Grace Baxter Fenderson. So I come knocking on her door, boom, 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 January 1949, I guess it was.
Yeah.
No, it was a little later than that. In 1951, I became a leader of the grammar school in 1949-50, emulating Jackie Robinson. And so in 1951, I was the president of the graduation, president of the class. And so I was preparing to make my graduation speech. So when I went and knocked on her door, she saw this little black kid coming in into her house saying he wanted to be a part of the struggle. So she, in her beauty and whatnot, amazement, brought me into the house, sat me down, and asked me who I was and what I was doing. And I told her I was a grammar school student graduating from Sussex Grammar Grammar School in Newark, New Jersey. A mainly white school, but the black students rose in terms of leadership, and I was an example of that. And so I said, I'm getting prepared to make my graduation speech. And so she said, well, that's wonderful. She said, do you have it together? I said, I think so. She said, well, let me hear it. So I actually presented my graduation speech to the class, to Miss Grace Baxter Fenderson, before I did to the class. And she said, wow. She said in February, a month from then, she said, we have our Lincoln Douglas biggest NAACP activity, and you're going to be a part of it. So at 12 and 13, I was moving from my 12th birthday to my 13th, January the 19th. And that's when I'm in the middle of NAACP struggle in the 50s. And then by the time the middle 50s come, I'm in college. And I was the president of the grammar school.
How many blacks did you have in college? Your class?
And that was the thing. In 1955, when I went into college at Lafayette College, I was given 12 schools to integrate. Brown, Penn, Amherst, other schools. I went to Lafayette College in 1955, and there were 2 blacks.
2 blacks.
And me and a fellow, Vic Partridge from Atlanta, entered, and we doubled the black population from 2 to 4, 100%.
Wow.
And, but because of the leadership training that comes out of the home and comes out of our community, I became one of the leaders of the college. I became the president of the Jewish fraternity, an elder in the church, a vice president of Knights of the Round Table. I stopped playing my saxophone. I used to play tenor sax and alto sax, but I still played college baseball. I still had the Jackie Robinson consciousness in me.
Yeah.
And that comes in 1946 and 47 when he came up from Montreal. My father used to take us to see the minor league games. My father was a part of the Negro League. And when Jackie came in 47, we came in with him.
Right.
And see, that's the personal spirit that helps to educate you. Now our imagery is around the musicians and the rappers and the 50 Cent. But we had images like Jackie Robinson, a Joe Louis,
but you see the
Paul
difference.
Robeson.
You see the difference then. You see the difference between the 50 Cent and the Jackie Robinson. Or even, I mentioned Nicki Minaj last week, and it's so disappointing to see the celebration on television where they were Maya Angelou and the best rapper was Nicki Minaj, and they had in 5-minute intervals, a whole from Queen to what?
Yes.
What would you call it?
Yes.
And young women emanating that kind of
right. And unfortunately, that changed from images that gave us strength and gave us a consciousness and knew we had to be a part of this enormous struggle to restore African humanity. That which moved us in the 40s and then became the reality in the 50s, and so the Jackie Robinsons, the Paul Robesons, the Joe Lewises became a part of our world. And by the 60s, it became institutionalized in terms of struggle, the explosion of the black communities, the black power movements, the urban rebellions, the movement against the lack of voting and whatnot. But by the 70s, in the 60s, the European world system, the American world system said, we've got to crush this fervor in our communities. And so there was a plan. Part of it we see in COINTELPRO, to smash the active black leadership. Part of it was to stop that black young man in the urban areas, because there was a McCoon report after the Watts Rebellion in 1965, and that McCoon report studying these urban explosions that had taken place in Harlem in 64, and then Watts, and then eventually in 66 and 67, dozens of explosions. That the dynamite in the urban area was the black youth 15 to 25. And that black youth needed to be stopped, reprogrammed. And so there's a systematic process of undercutting the development of the black youth that stems from that period, became professionalized in the 70s, including COINTELPRO, infiltrating black organizations, became demonized into the 70s and 80s when they were actually, with government connivance, dumping drugs in the black communities.
I thought it didn't start till the Reagan came in 1980. Well, I thought up to Carter it was pretty sweet, I thought.
Well, but Carter and others were the symbols at the top of the government. Below the symbols at the top is the reality, which is death, domination, I call it the 3 Ds. Domination, destruction, and death. And that domination, destruction, and death was not, it was perfected in the 80s. But it starts in the 50s when the McCarthy era of witch hunting, progressive black folk take place. And then it continues, particularly into the Cold War. And when you get looking for communists under every rug, and every progressive struggle potentially is a communist. So then you get the CIA set up. You get the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, which started it. And so it perfects its role in the 50s and in the 60s. The murder and assassination of African leaders, when I was in Europe and studying, I graduated college, one of the leaders of the college, and then I won a Rotary International Fellowship, so I went to study in Europe. But the NAACP is a part of my experience. Raising our own history. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of my heroes in terms of, and then my mother and my her father were Garveyites, so Garvey was a part of my experience.
Your mother and father were Garveyites.
Okay.
Like Malcolm.
And then I was born on my grandfather's birthday, January 19th. He was born 1888, 10 years after Marcus Garvey, but he was a Garveyite. And so when I was born in January 37, 1919, I was born into a Garvey tradition. So that Pan-Africanism, that nationalism has been a part of my upbringing. But also, I had to learn to live with white folks, and I didn't have a lack of identity on who I was. I knew I was a young man who was going to make it, so I was their leader as well. So if I led the grammar school, and I was a leader in the high school, which was largely white, so when I moved into college, I was a leader in the college, so when I became president of Jewish fraternity, that was a normal and natural continuation of the leadership. So at the end of the college experience, I won the Rotary International Fellowship to study in Europe. And so that was 1959. So I delayed going to law school to be a young Thurgood Marshall, and I went to Europe, and that was the best thing that ever happened to me, because I realized that the American education system was not educating us for the world. And it was not dealing with the emerging technology. It was not dealing with nationalism. It was not dealing with communism. It was not dealing with the emergence of Africa. So all of that I met in Europe, and that prepared me for the next 50 years.
Tell me what you...
And it was at that point that I met Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, one of our greatest minds, when I went to Paris to try to find Africans that were conscious. Because the Africans that I met in Switzerland and other parts of Europe when I traveled, I was anxious to meet them. There weren't many blacks in Europe, and I would go up to people and I'd say, "Brother, who are you? Where are you from?" in French, because I spoke French. I was in French-speaking area, and they would respond, "Je suis français." I'm French. And so after meeting black person after black person that was French, and these people were coming from Senegal, even from Guinea, from Cameroon, from Ivory Coast, I said, well, maybe I'll find some love and affection with one of these light-skinned brothers, like my biological brother, Marlon. And so I ran after that, and he was in Europe at that time, in Germany, in the military, and we had met in Europe. This was 1958 that he went to Europe, and we met in 59. And but the beautiful thing was, interesting enough, with this brother relationship I had with this great brother of mine, I was looking forward into some of these light-skinned fellows. So I ran after them. "Brother, who are you? Where are you from?" "Je suis français." They were from Guadeloupe, Martinique, French Guyana, or the elite of Haiti. And it was clear that Africans getting high-powered education were not being trained to identify with their own people and their own roots. And so that was a turning point in my consciousness. And I wrote about it. When I came back in October, I wrote for the college newspaper, A Closer Look at the World, that we were preparing our people for a niche in the American system and a good job, and not taking on these enormous responsibilities that we would collectively have in the world. And it would have it, that was October that this article was published. In November, a few weeks later, I went back to the college for a football weekend. I went to the manse where the chaplain lived, and it was a student-run church, and I was one of the leaders of the student-run church. So when I knocked on the red door, the door opened, and Chaplain Curry is sitting like you and I are sitting with a black man, this white man. Chaplain Curry is sitting with a black man, and as soon as I walk in, he sees me, he lights up and he says to the black man, "That's the man for your program." And the world has never been the same since then. That man was Reverend James H. Robertson, who had a church in Harlem, the Church of the Master, who went to school with Kwame Nkrumah and Lincoln University. And when Ghana became independent in '57, he decided to set up a program to link Africa and Black America and White America together. So he set up Operation Crossroads Africa in 1958. And so here, my wife went in 1960 before I met her. And then in 1960, I meet him. And immediately, the law school is pushed to the side, and I finish it, but I'm heading to Africa. And so not only do I head to Africa, he's like a John Henry Clark. He adopts people, and I was like his son, just like I was like a young son, a young partner for Dr. John Henry Clark. So Reverend James H. Robinson opened up this world of Africa to me.
Okay.
I met him in 60. By 61 summer, I was in West Africa. At 62, I was back in West Africa. 63, I was back. My wife had been on his program. He married us in 64. We went to live in Africa in 65, 66. I did my master's on Senegal's economic development plan in 62, 63 at Columbia University. The first person, myself and Ufete Kojo and a white fellow, Richard Hull, we were the first to get the Columbia master's degree in African studies. And mine was on the Senegal economic development plan and the regional integration of West Africa. I could see in those years of the 60s that Africa was producing these nations, but they needed to be integrated into a regional power formation. And so in 66, I won a Rockefeller Fellowship to go to live in Africa to do my PhD, and I did it on the economic development plan of the Ivory Coast. And it was at that time that we met the great leaders of Africa, Sekou Touré of Guinea, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Modibo Keïta of Mali, Senghor of Senegal. We met the great scholars, Cheikh Anta Diop, doing their work. So in the late 50s and early 60s, I'm heavy into this stuff. So you're talking about a great and mighty walk for 50 years, you know. And it's been wonderful.
How do you feel about President Obama?
Well, President Obama, if we take Wade Noble's understanding that African people everywhere suffer greatly from a shattered consciousness and a fractured identity, we are trained not to be black. If you're from the Caribbean, even Marcus Garvey's island, Jamaica, the educational system is designed to fit you into the world as an Englishman. A black Englishman, Barbados.
Still today?
Today, much of that is the same case. You go to Harvard, you go to City College. We put a black educational component in there that now has been devastated. But for 40 years, we were training youngsters not only to master the European world, but master your world. So if you put that synthesis together, you know how to function in the European world. You know how to even out European the European American, but then you have this African component. So when you put those two together, that's a dynamic duo. And that's what Obama has. He's comfortable. Most people don't understand. He had a white mother. He was raised by white grandparents. He studied in Indonesia. So he's comfortable in his whiteness. But also he had a Kenyan father. And the struggle of his growing up wrapped around the blackness. And then he eventually married a black woman. So he's comfortable in his blackness. So you have this man at the head of the White House who can deal with white folks. And he can deal with black folks. He's not a black nationalist. He wasn't trained that way. He's not a white nationalist. And so you have this unusual phenomena of a black man sitting in the White House doing what he thinks is best for the country, and we kick him in the butt because he's not doing enough for black folk. White people said he's not even the president. He's not an American.
The racism.
And it's deeper than racism. Because racism is not when you take the wife of this man, who is the president of the United States, and you demonize her arms, that she is showing her beautiful arms, and you demonize that. You don't even deal with the fact that she graduated from Princeton University, so she's mastered your best education. She went on to Harvard and graduated from Harvard Law School before Obama, so she's mastered that level. And then she's produced two beautiful angels that are floating around the White House, and you demonize this couple. You're upset with her because she goes to China without her husband. She takes her children, and she takes her mother, who raised her and who's helping to raise her children in the White House, and they demonize her for taking him up. There's a deepness of racism in America that's real. And Obama's election doesn't change that. He's been able to manage it because he's on both sides of the question. But they want to demonize him as not even a real president. He's the worst president that we've ever had. That's what they say. Well, that's good. Because that means that maybe he hasn't been doing all of that white racist mess that they would want to be done. Killing off leaders, exploiting countries, flying into Haiti and taking the leadership out of Haiti and flying it to Africa and acting as if this is what you do.
What about Libya?
All of that. But That's what
But
I'm saying.
yeah, I
that
see a lot of black people are blaming him for Libya.
Right. And so...
Well, what's your take on Libya then?
Well, Libya is a deep question. We'd have to have a show on Libya. And we'd have to have a show on Gaddafi, who had his revolutionary stirring in '69. And so he paralleled the awakeness in the Arab world in the 50s with Gamal Nasser and Naguib in Egypt, and then in the Sudan in '56, and then in the '60s, other and the revolution of Algeria, and most people don't, that he's a part of that flow of history.
But that's 40, 50 years ago,
But
right?
the Arab world has been fighting the African world of who's going to dominate.
Right.
And so he got caught up in the fact that he was not a true Arab in the sense of the Saudis and the rest. And so they virtually pushed him out of the Arab world.
Is that what that is?
He became the N word in the Arab world. So he said, I'm going to put a capital on that N word, and I'm going to bond with my brothers who are African.
With the darker.
That's right. And
South.
we're on the same continent. We're not in Saudi Arabia. We're not in Iraq or Iran or Turkey. And so he switched over a period of years of bonding, or as Walter Rodney has a book, Bonding with My Brothers, bonding with those on the African continent. And then he became a leader in the sense he knew what to do with the money. Let's set up our own banking system. Let's have our own military command for the continent. Let's deal with the various cultural relationships that we have, because we have traditional African culture, we have Muslim, we have the Europeanized culture. And so he began to think deep. Because he was rejected by the Arab world, he began to play an unusual role of enhancing the African world. And so he was destroyed as part of this process. It's much deeper than any of us realize.
Well, you know what I want to do? I want to bring it home to this planet, to this area, and concentrate on America and another one of our...
Well, it's a separate planet, so you do not misspeak. This is a separate planet that develops a separate mentality that can kill off our indigenous people, the Native Americans, and then act as if we're celebrating Thanksgiving, and they're celebrating with us when the worst genocide in the history of the world took place with the Native Americans. The most oppressive dehumanization took place with the Africans. This is a special planet.
But most black people do not understand that.
Because we've worked hard to survive, and survival meant trying to be human and acceptable to the white system. We had to do it in the plantations. We had to do it in the post-plantation devastation.
What about today, though?
But now, today, from the 50s and the 60s, we said, no, we're going to define ourselves as African. We're going to define ourselves as black. We're going to define ourselves as black power. And they've never forgiven us for that. That's what we're dealing with now. So part of our population is being sucked into this being American, and then denying your root, which is African. Part of it is being sucked into the technology, and you're masters of the technology. Well, Africa doesn't have anything to do with technology. Africa originated technology. And then part of it is that these young people are a threat because they potentially can explode in our urban areas. So we've created a new slavery called the prison system. And it's in effect. And one of our great sisters, Michelle Alexander, has written a book called The New Jim Crow. But one of our great sisters before her, whose shoulder she stands on, Dr. Shashi McIntyre, one of Dr. Clark's Tiger Cubs, Shashi wrote a book called Criminalizing a Race. How from the beginning of the nation, the prison system was set up as the vehicle to hold black runaways and penalize and threaten the black population, intimidate. So we need this long view of history. We don't need the short view of history that would take somebody like 50 Cent and make him into an iconic hero and then have him become a multimillionaire. And now some of the rappers are talking about being billionaires, and they're not using any of their money to set up foundations, to build schools, to do any of the things that people with money do. So we have these images of successful money makers, but they're not using their money to set up institutions and processes and movements that would leave a legacy.
Let's talk a little bit about Gil Noble.
Who's that?
That's my hero. I mean,
my partner.
I wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't for Gil Noble. I mean, I admire and respected that man so much. And we have a clip on Gil, and he talks about
Okay.
Malcolm. And we're going to skip over one of, I had you in Nubia in 204. I
Yes.
had a clip on that. But we're going to go past that and go to Gil. And before we go to that,
And we have to come back to Nubia, because Nubia is the key to our history.
I know. But
It's
we'll
a
go to
keystone
that
to our
after
history.
Gil.
Whatever you wish. It's,
All right.
it's your program. I don't want to take you from your
You want to
program.
go to Gil? You want to go to Gil,
Yes,
or you want to go to
yes.
Nubia?
No, we'll go to Gil. I want to.
I want to update
was-
us some, a little bit, and then maybe we
Right.
can have time to go back to that.
Yeah.
Like you see that.
No, I was a partner of Gil before I went
Yeah.
to Nubia.
Yeah, well, Gil is a fascinating look on how we see each other. See, my concentration on this show has always been how we treat one another.
Yes.
And this is, I think, our biggest problem, especially today. You know, you had the fortune of coming up in an era where you were the only black in most instances, and you didn't lack any self-esteem. You had images that of us as black people.
Right. But clarify that.
Well,
the
we had the Sambo. Of course.
foundation is a strong family where mother and father
Right.
were giants, where the aunts and uncles, the grandparents were giants, in a community which was a village in Newark, New Jersey. I lived on 14th Street with my mother and father. My mother's family lived 13th Street. My father's family lived 12th Street. The bulk of the neighborhood was still white, but still, of the 100 black youngsters I grew up with, 90 of us made it big.
But what does Newark look like today?
Newark is very interesting. You don't have it. People don't have an image of Newark. If you go to the Weequahic section where a lot of the black leadership lives, it looks like Forest Hills in New York.
Really?
Yes,
Okay.
beautiful homes. It was the
Okay.
area that the Jewish community used to live in. Black people have maintained the homes, and they maintain the institutions. They have. That's where Leonard Jeffries lives.
Okay.
He has a home on Chancellor Avenue, and the Barakas live in the Clinton Hill area of that South Ward. And that's where you have these big houses like you have in Brooklyn, around Brooklyn College. That's where black folks live. My wife family lived 2 doors from the Barakas in a beautiful home with pillars like it was a plantation. So there's more to Newark than meets the eye. Newark is not drugs and not just murders and drive-bys. It was communities. Every area of Newark was like a village. At one point, I lived across town with my aunt and in a housing project. We integrated the housing projects in 46. In 47, when my mother and father, someone bought our house, my mother and father went to live with his older sister on 12th Street, who raised him, and we went all the way across Newark, down into the industrial area where they had built a housing project called Riverview Court. And we were the first black people to integrate that housing project. But again, it was a village. And again, we got the nourishment of respect of self and of your community. Again, we had institutions, churches. These churches raised us in a sense of who and what we were. And so we had sports. My mother had me playing the saxophone, my brother playing drums. And she trained us to manage our world. Before you run out to play ball, you got to get your school lessons. After your school lessons, you got to do your music lessons. After music lessons, make sure the house is clean. Don't bring any of your little friends in here and mess up my house. And then you go out and play. So you learn to manage your world. You respected your ancestors, and you learned to live with white folks. You weren't at war with them. They were our buddies. When they had discrimination in Newark, New Jersey, up until 47, when we went to the movies, the white boys could go anywhere. They could go down in the main part of we had to go up in the balcony. So our little game was to sneak down when the lights were out, to sneak down and find our little white friends sitting in the other. So in other words, we never got the heavy marks on us by our circumstances because we had sense of self. We had a consciousness and we had an identity. When Africa exploded, that identity became global. And the consciousness, I saw the family in the Caribbean as part of my family, in Brazil as part of my family, and Africa as part of my family. I went to Europe and I met Africans in Europe that were part of my family. So another consciousness, a greater consciousness has developed. And Gil Noble and Dr. Clark represent 2 of the best components of that consciousness and expanding it globally.
All right, let's go to Gil, and he's talking about Malcolm. This is part 2. You saw part 1 last week. You have time, Darlin? See if we can put Gil on. It's a bit, it's only 6 minutes, but we'll come back after that. All right? Our guest today, Professor Dr. Leonard Jeffries.
It was awful. And so I learned about Malcolm, and I realized that I had been had. I realized that
You
I
had
had
bought
missed.
what the media had told you.
Yes, I bought it, hook, line, and sinker. But when I heard Malcolm's entire presentation, everything fell in line, and it was logical. And it made me understand that there's no sin in being angry. In fact, if you're not angry, there's something wrong with you.
And why do you think Malcolm was killed?
I
The
think there's
real issues.
I think that there are a number of reasons why he was killed. And it's a very, very painful reality that we need to deal with. He was a threat to America's global ambitions. He had done a lot in Africa to awaken the African countries and let them understand that they should not be victim of the courtship that American businesses were engaged in, the Peace Corps and all these things, because they don't love you. They want your minerals. If they did, look what they're doing to us, and we're your brothers and sisters. Look what they're doing to us in, Mississippi and whatnot. And so many of them began to quote Malcolm on the floor of the United Nations, ironically. So I think that that's one dimension that the State Department, and they tried to kill him when he was in Egypt. They poisoned him, but he had his stomach pumped and he survived. So that was one dimension. Then there were the authorities here in this country that also wanted him to leave this life. And then there was a lot of factionalism within the Nation of Islam. And there was a lot of greed, there was a lot of ambitiousness, and there was a lot of friction, because the Nation of Islam had grown into an economic colossus.
And self-sufficiency.
They were self-sufficient.
The same things that your parents practiced.
Exactly. And they were a threat. They had their own schools. They had their own religion.
Food.
They had their own name, their own diet. They were self-sufficient. And that was a threat.
Big time.
And so I think that there are some people who were in the nation who, many of the people who had been fished by Malcolm into joining the nation had been on the street like he had. And a lot of them, as the money started to come in, some of the old temptations began to take over. I interviewed a man, Talmadge Hayer, in prison, and he told me that he thought that Malcolm was a hypocrite and that he was wrong in bad-mouthing Elijah. He told me this on camera.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me how they went about assassinating him and, how determined they were to take him out.
He really believed it, you think?
Oh, he really did. He thought, and the more Malcolm protested, the angrier they became. And so he took me right through. He was one of the gunmen. He had a pistol, and he described how there were 3 gunmen. 1 had a rifle and 2 had pistols. He was one of the gunmen. The rifle went off first and struck down Malcolm, and then the 2 men with revolvers went up to the stage and emptied their revolvers. Mm-hmm. And he told me that he was convinced that he had done the right thing, And I asked him, I said, in your life, have you ever so much as spat at a member of the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan? Or did you ever smack one? And he dropped his head and he said, no.
Did he understand the meaning of that question, do you think?
I made it clear.
Mm-hmm.
But he said that it wasn't until years later, while in prison, that he came to understand that Malcolm was not lying, he was not wrong, and that there was corruption. And he had a nervous breakdown in prison because he realized that who he had taken off.
Yes, exactly.
You know, so I mean, this was just a very, very painful experience, and it's something that we are not yet wrestling with. I don't want to get overly philosophical, but I just wanted to respond to your question that Malcolm had a tremendous impact on me after he was dead.
Afterwards.
Yes, because after that I became hungry to get this story and learn more about this extraordinary man. Alex Haley just came out with the book soon after the assassination. Got to know Alex, became very good friends. And I got to know Betty and the whole family, all of his, and so I began to fill out this cavity. I had this rich nourishment from Martin, but the cavity that my ignorance had created with Malcolm was beginning to be filled in. And then even more significant, I think, were the role that the students played.
Yes.
Because I think that that's something that today's students don't really understand.
Got to share that. Why have you been sitting on it down here and up in your home? That has. I mean, I have not seen that footage, and Gil and I were so close. I've heard him express those same things, but that captures so much in that moment, and then he's able to speak about. You can't just think in terms of just the Nation of Islam's involvement, but you had an international process that they wanted to stop.
Right.
And so there's plenty of reason on that side. And then you had a national process that this government feared.
Right.
And then you had the internal insanity that could have produced that. And then you had COINTELPRO with people placed inside of organizations as agents provocateurs to create.
Wait a minute. Elijah Muhammad did have 6 or 7 young females that were pregnant by him.
Yes, and that's
all right.
That's
now, what did that do to Malcolm?
Right.
I mean, your hero suddenly is a what?
Right. That caused
a dirty old man.
No,
the least.
That caused great difficulty, but then there's ways. What
did he call a traitor because he found out the truth?
No, but what people would say is that's family business. It should be handled within the family, and so you can see the
Honorable Elijah Muhammad.
Well,
6 or 7 young girls pregnant but in America. I know African tradition.
But we have honorable fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and things that go on, and we keep it. That's the family linen. So you don't take it outside the family. So we can understand. Yes, that was a difficult period for him. Luckily, Gil has chance. He explained it well. That at first he didn't appreciate who Malcolm was, and then he had a chance not only to appreciate him, but he had a chance to have him become part of the fire in his belly. He used it as filling up a cavity, but it's a fire that he had that Malcolm helped him to appreciate, and he was able to produce on the screen like nobody else has the images of our struggle and whatnot. So it was a tragedy, but for Gil it was a blessing.
Yeah, for a lot of us. A lot of us felt that way.
Many of us.
About Malcolm.
And interesting enough, just most recently, the legacy of Malcolm has been carried by members of his family and others, and they met those who are responsible for the Organization of African American Unity. Malcolm had set up several organizations, including Muslim Mosque Incorporated and Afro-American Organization of Afro-American Unity at the time that the Africans on the continent were setting up the OAU, the Organization of African Unity. He set up a parallel organization for the Africans in the New World. And so Professor Smalls has been a major person carrying that legacy. Rodnell Collins, the son of Malcolm's sister, Ella Collins, has been a major player, and Brother Starks and others. Well, the leadership of that group met to ask me to take on the international national president of executive director. So it's a key position with like-minded folks that we can move. And this is beautiful because this is the period, the year, that the Organization of African Unity that became the AU, the African Union, they met last year in Addis Ababa. A couple hundred leaders of our world, I was there at the time, and they agreed that May the 25th, 2013, was the turnaround year. And this year, May 25th, 2014, the theme is Pan-Africanism and the African Renaissance. And what they wanted African people to do was to look back 50 years and to do an analysis, a retrospective on what we did right, what we did wrong, how we missed opportunities, how we could have enhanced what we needed to do. So a 50-year analysis from the formation. And this period also is the 50th year of Malcolm's organization. And so we are in doing that same retrospect. So revising and revitalizing and reemerging Malcolm's organization will be an important part of our projection the next 50 years. So that's what the AU said. Look back 50 years, do an assessment and analysis. Use this year as the turnaround, Pan-Africanism and the African Renaissance being the theme, and then project the next 50 years. So what you are trying to do with Dr. Clark and with Gil and Malcolm fits into this process.
What about the disrespect that we have for each other?
Well,
for instance, let me mention this about Malcolm. You know, I mentioned you, Phil Valentine has this video out where he claims that Malcolm is Obama's daddy. I mean, and you see a lot of our community believe that kind of crap.
Well,
and they want to hate anything with white in it.
Right. But there's freedom of speech in these United States. And as a human being, you do have a measure of freedom to express yourself.
But how about sensibility?
Even if it's not connected, even if it's stupid, even if it's insult.
Come on.
No one has received more insults than the person you're talking to. You go on the internet, you type in the name Leonard Jeffries Jr. or Dr. Leonard Jeffries Jr. There's 1 million hits. A couple of years ago, before I retired, there was 949,000. In other words, 1 million hits that I'm the worst person in the history of the world. And it has come from around the world. However, that does not move or shake me.
Wait a minute.
It allows me to be firmer and stronger in my Africanness.
Phil Valentine, noted historian, very light.
Phil Valentine and others, claiming, we even had Dr. Khalid Muhammad and others who spoke their special truth. And
but Malcolm being Obama's daddy?
Well, I'd have to see the context. I'd have to see the context of it. I would not want to spend our valuable time and talking about the consciousness of African peoples to focus on somebody's statement. That's what they did with me. They said he said something about the Jewish involvement in slavery. Well, I have 50 books on the Jewish involvement in slavery, 32 of them written by Jews themselves. So, but that was demonized, the Jewish involvement in Hollywood. I said, I know what the Hollywood image is really all about. I grew up with it. No one has to tell me, and I'm not talking about whether Jews control Hollywood or not. That's not. It's the image that came across. But when they want to twist things around, they say, well, Jeffrey said something about the Jews in Hollywood. You have 12 main studios. 11 of them were owned by Jewish people. The one that wasn't was Universal Studios, and that was Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., D.W. Griffith. But it was run by one of the Jewish leaders. So, but it's not a question of who controls what. It's a question of the negative images that are still being perpetuated through these media formulations doesn't allow this enormous truth to emerge, that African peoples are not a sidebar or a subhuman branch of the human family, that African peoples are the center of the human family, that the human family emerges out of Africa, that history and culture is something that the Africans have contributed to the world. So I'd rather spend my time not being noted as somebody as a hater, because I don't hate anybody. As a person who has revealed the great truth and has held it up at the risk of his life, that's what I want to be noted for. And then the Dr. Clarks, the Dr. Benns, and the Gil Nobles have all carried that truth to different levels in their particular areas. And so I know what you mean, but I want to be able to raise Sheikh Anta Diop and Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark and our great sisters and my wife and others who are doing their serious work than to be dealing with some of our people who want to say things for effect, and often it creates effect. It may sell some tapes. It may cause...
Yeah. I really got upset about it because it was insulting to everybody involved, you know, especially Obama, and to think that it was just a hatred for white people, which I saw coming from Phil, that it wasn't helpful for anybody.
Well, my thing is not to get stuck on this particular aspect of our struggle. It creates what I call a paralysis of analysis. That what you want is a systems analysis. And then you can see that the system that has tried to destroy our people and then created what Bob Marley talks about, mental slavery and these other things, can produce all of this type of behavior that you're referencing. But the beautiful thing is that there's been an explosion of the truth, and our people are now trying to restructure their world around this truth. And I travel around the world, so I see it happening everywhere. And I wish that that experience that I've experienced can be really told. And maybe any chance you get to give me an opportunity to tell it, that's the thing
you have
that
to come back. We might have you back at least once a month.
Yes.
Would you do that?
I
mean, it's a learning experience for me. And Dr. Jeffries, you know, it's always a joy having you here. I've got a lot of stuff in the archives I can bring out.
Well,
we can enjoy this trip.
If our friend Minister Clemson Brown does not get back from his family reunion,
where's he at?
He's at a family reunion. He disappeared on me. And I have to come up with a 5-minute presentation of my life for a honor that Reverend Karen Daughtry and the women organization that she heads is having an activity at the end of the month, and I have to create something. So if I can't find my friend Clemson Brown, I may have to go to my friend Winston GILCHRIST to see whether we can put something together.
Well, anytime you, please come back. And I'd just like to say, this has been an honor and a real treat for me to just sit here and listen to you, Dr. Jeffries. You know, it's an eye-opener to me that I'm not the only fortunate one to be raised in an era where, you know, being black was something, you know, superior rather than inferior. Again, the God in me loves the God in you. Please come back to the GILCHRIST experience. God bless.
Hotep, peace.
Right?
The struggle continues.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen, man. That's a bet. And I guess we're still here. And please return to the GILCHRIST experience.
Right.
58. Yeah, that was good. That was good.
Yeah, well, the clips of, and that was interesting to see Jack Johnson overlooking the shoulder of Gil. There was a portrait of Jack Johnson, the boxer.
I missed that.
Usually, yes. Usually you see Gil. Now, what are you doing? Following me around? Usually you see Gil with that Ira